She wanted desperately to complete the fossil display before the museum closed for the holidays, and she already had a load of fish specimens from Captain Hussen's last voyage waiting to be mounted. But I thought how good everyone at Irvin and Johnson had been to me, and it being so near to Christmas, I thought the least I could do would be to go down to the docks to wish them the compliments of the season. She grabbed a grain sack and called her native assistant, Enoch, and together they caught a taxi to the wharf. I went in to see Mr. Jackson, she recalls 60 years later. And now, as I was going out, he said, "Well, I don't think it's quite 1.5 tons of sharks, but a happy Christmas to you." They used to torment the life out of me. She hitched up her cotton dress and climbed onto the 115-foot Nareen. The crew had all gone ashore, except for an old Scotsman, who told her that the specimens were on the forecastle deck. She looked at the pile of fish, sharks, seaweed, starfish, sponges, rat-tail fishes, all kinds of things. She told the Scotsman she probably would not be taking anything. Nevertheless, she sorted them out carefully. It was then that she noticed a blue fin sticking up from beneath the pile. "I picked away the layers of slime to reveal the most beautiful fish I had ever seen," she recounts. "It was 5 feet long, a pale mauvey blue with faint flecks of whitish spots. It had an iridescent silver blue-green sheen all over. It was covered in hard scales, and it had 4 limb-like fins and a strange little puppy dog tail. It was such a beautiful fish, more like a big china ornament, but I didn't know what it was." "Yes, miss, it's a strange one," the old Scotsman said. Oh God, I've got to do a Scottish accent. "I've been trawling for over 30 years. I won't do that. But I have never seen its like. It snapped at the captain's fingers as he looked at it in the trawl net. We thought you would be interested." He told her that it had been trawled at a depth of 40 fathoms off the mouth of the Chalumna River, and that when Captain Hussen first saw it, he thought it so beautiful that he wanted to set it free. Marjorie said she would definitely take this one back to the museum. She and Enoch eased the large fish, it weighed 127 pounds, into the sack and carried it to the taxi. The driver was horrified. "I refuse to take any stinking fish in my new taxi," he exclaimed. Marjorie replied, "It is not stinking. It is perfectly fresh. And if that is the case, I will get another taxi. I brought you here to collect fish for the museum." He relented, and they carefully lowered the fish into the boot of the car. I was confused. I'd certainly never seen anything like it before, yet there was a voice nagging in my head. I kept on thinking back to school, where I had written lines about a ganoid fish, an ancient group distinguished by their heavy armor of scales. I had a teacher, Sister Camilla, whose father was a paleontologist at Uppsala University in Sweden, and he used to teach his daughter about marine paleontology, and so she was always teaching us about fish. And on this day, I wasn't paying attention, and she turned to me and said, "You little Latimer, what's a fossil fish?" And you little Latimer didn't know, because she hadn't been listening. "You little Latimer will write 25 lines. A ganoid fish is a fossil fish. A ganoid fish is a fossil fish." And so you little Latimer wrote it out 25 times. I've still got the book. And so back at the museum, as I stared at the strange scales on this fish, those lines kept going around in my head. A ganoid fish is a fossil fish. In other words, a fish that had long since become extinct and is known only from fossil records. The scales, the 4 limbs, all pointed towards it being a ganoid fish. I was so near to classifying it as a ganoid fish, but I thought it couldn't be a fossil fish because it was alive. I didn't think it could be, but I just knew it was something valuable.
The accents. We'll have her do further accents later in the day. But we will, this was in a sense sort of mankind's reintroduction to the coelacanth. And I was wondering what your own introduction to the coelacanth was and what sort of circumstances you first came upon this fish.
Well, I'd actually written a book before about a French mercenary called Bob Denard, who'd staged all these coups on these small islands called the Comoros, which are between Madagascar and Mozambique. 4 little, beautiful, lost, very, very poor islands. And I was fascinated by that story, so I went there to chase after this old French dog of war. And one day it was raining, And I went into the museum. And in the museum, there's only one museum. I mean, there's only sort of one roundabout and no traffic lights in the whole country. There's in the capital, Moroni. Okay. And I went into the museum, and there was this big tank full of formaldehyde, and in it was this kind of extraordinary-looking fish, and I'd never seen anything like it before. And I just read a little inscription below it, and it said how this coelacanth was a fish that had been found, in fact, the second coelacanth, which we'll probably get onto, was found in the Comoros Islands in 1952. And just something about the story of how it was found captured my imagination. And I couldn't get it out of my head, and I wrote the Bob Dinard book. And then I went back to London, and I tried to write a short story about it, very much, I mean, just actually a complete rip-off of Hemingway's Old Man and the Sea. But this fish kept going around in my head, and then one day I just thought, well, I'd like to go back and find the real story of the coelacanth. And
but what was the intrigue? I mean, what about the coelacanth intrigued you so much?
Well, it was the story that this was a fish that had been known before from fossil records. And it had first appeared 400 million years ago. And then the fossil records had disappeared 70 million years ago. So this fish was thought to be extinct. But when it was discovered in 1839 by Louis Agassiz in some rocks in England, actually. And 20 years later, he called it a Coelacanthus granulatus. But people noticed it's strange. Look here, hang on. 1 second. I can even... There's the fossil. There we go.
And this is the first one? So this is...
this isn't actually the first one, but this is a better one that's at the Natural History Museum. And 20 years later, Darwin's On the Origin of Species was published, and that really got people excited about evolution. And they thought, because these fish had these strange limb-like fins, that this could be the missing link, the first fish that crawled out of the sea to become an amphibian, a lizard, everything up to us. So people were very excited by this fish. But because it had disappeared so long ago, they had no way of actually knowing whether it was that missing link.
But in the 19th century, when they found this fossil, I mean, were they aware of the concept of other living fossils? I mean, did they know that there were other things out there that, or is that concept itself a 20th century one?
No, it's a 19th century. They did know about some of them. There's the sequoia tree. I don't know whether they decided it was a living fossil in the 19th century or 20th century. But there's the horseshoe crab. There's all sorts of things that have disappeared. But, no one thought that this fish was going to reappear. I mean, it was extraordinary.
Yeah, and this was the first, I guess the first of its kind. I mean, do we have a photo of the first?
We don't have a photo of the first one.
Okay.
But we have a photo of his, hang on, this is the second one. So what happened? After Marjorie Courtney Latimer found the first one, she rushed to try and preserve this fish, and there's this wonderful story of her charging around East London and trying to find a place, a freezer that she could put the fish in, and she went first to the hospital, and they said, I'm not having any stinking fish in here, and then she went to the cold storage, and they wouldn't have it either. And so she was desperate to try and preserve this fish until she could get someone to identify it properly. And eventually she went to a taxidermist who wrapped it in formaldehyde, and she borrowed some sheets from her mother, and they desperately battled to keep this fish intact. And she, meanwhile, sent a telegram to someone called Professor J.L.B. Smith, who was the fish expert. He was actually a physics teacher, but he was the one guy who knew about fish. And he didn't get the telegram for 13 days, and in the meantime, this fish decomposed. And it was 2 months later that Smith actually got to East London to see the fish, and he looked at it, and there's this wonderful quote. He's felt bombs going off in his brain, and he couldn't quite believe it, and he thought it was preposterous. But he knew instantly, he recognized from that, oh no, I'm going the wrong way now. Pointing the wrong direction. Oh, everything's going wrong now. Anyway, he recognized from that fossil that, from that first fossil that you saw, he recognized that this was a coelacanth. And he then thought, I've got to find another one, because all the innards of the fish had been destroyed in the heat and not being able to preserve it in a freezer. So he sort of pretty much gave up being a physicist and devoted the next 14 years of his life to trying to find another coelacanth. And he and his wife traveled around the Indian Ocean and southern Africa and put up reward posters everywhere. And he was just he was a very single-minded man, and he was absolutely determined that he was going to find another coelacanth. And then 14 years later, in 1952, he was in Durban in South Africa when he got a telegram from this captain of a trawler called Eric Hunt. And that's the captain, not the trawler. And he... Hunt said, you know, found coelacanth, come quickly. And so Smith then had to get to these Comoros Islands, which are where we were talking about earlier, to get to this fish. But it was 2 days before Christmas, and he had no way of getting there, and he sort of tried to borrow a plane, and eventually, you know, he went to everyone to try and get a plane. And eventually, he had to ring up on Christmas Eve, D.F. Malan, who was the Prime Minister of South Africa. He was the man who invented apartheid. He was a strict Calvinist. He didn't believe in evolution. And he had to say to this guy, please, can I have a plane? It's a matter of national importance that I get an army plane to go to the Comores and get a fish. And D.F. Malan, rather amazingly, said, okay, I know this man Smith, you can have a plane. And the next day, on Christmas Day, they set off for the Comores to go and fetch this fish back to South Africa. And this is okay, now let's, so this is a picture of the second fish, the fish that was in the Comores. And there is Smith.
And this is the one you saw when you were doing...
This is the one that I saw.
Okay.
No, actually, it's not the one I saw. It's this one he took back to South Africa. I saw another one after that.
Okay, all right.
But anyway, this one, the second one.
They all look similar.
They all look very, very different. Except this one didn't look the same because somehow when it had been caught, they'd chopped off the dorsal fin. So they thought it was a different species initially that didn't have one of the top fins. But actually, they found out later that it was the same one. And Smith then took this, he wrapped it up in kapok and put it in a coffin and put it in the back of this Air Force plane and flew it back to South Africa, where it was greeted with enormous fanfare, and the world's press was there. And a whole, Smith took the coffin with the coelacanth out and spent the night in Durban with the coffin beside him, with the fish beside him in a barracks, where he was guarded by a special Zulu impi to make sure that the fish was safe.
It's remarkable. One of the things that struck me when I was reading the book is how the appeal that the coelacanth had as a project, as a scientific project, to the public. I mean, it became, very soon, it became a matter of political and national prestige. The French who ruled the Comoros Islands insisted that the coelacanth that were caught in their waters belonged to the French nation. I mean, there were sort of political and diplomatic spats. I mean, in a way that we don't see very much today with science and scientific projects. It really caught the imagination of the public very soon.
I mean, that's what I loved about this story. Yeah. It was a story, first of all, it's a way of seeing the whole story of evolution, which is through a sort of a prism of this one, actually, essentially a very human story. I mean, it's a story about a fish, but it's a story about the discovery of the fish. But it's also a story about the excitement of science. Yeah. And I think too often these days we think of science being done by people in white lab coats and test tubes and pipettes and things like that. This was about adventure. This is Indiana Jones. I mean, this is really exciting. Yeah. And I think those days, you know, it was such a big, it was still so new, the whole idea of evolution. Yeah. And they were still trying to find those sort of missing links. So this was a real physical manifestation of the story of humanity and how we fit into the world. Yeah. And you know, there was headlines in a paper saying the best fish story for 50 million years. You know, it's fantastic.
Yeah. And in fact, I mean, you mentioned that this is also, in a sense, a human story. And like the best science books, A Fish Caught in Time talks a lot about J.L.B. Smith, who is sort of this brilliant character around which, you know, he himself was a character. He was this sort of archetype, obsessive scientist. And the book is, in a sense, built around him. And I was wondering if maybe we could talk a little bit more about him, and you could, you know, sort of describe a little bit about what he was like and, you know, how this obsession took him over.
Well, I mean, he was totally brilliant. People talk about all these sort of instances. I remember his son told me about how he'd been walking in a street and he recognized some guy on the other side of the street as being the son of a man that he was at school with, and he recognized him from the shape of his head.
From the back of his head. Too.
From the back of his head. I mean, he was an extraordinary man, but he was such an obsessive. I mean, his children were, you know, they were hardly ever fed or taken off to school. Neighbors had to look after them because he and his wife, when they were sort of thinking about the fish or working on them, did so at the expense of everything else.
Yeah.
I mean, they were totally obsessive, and they'd travel around the world, leaving their children behind for years on end, as far as I can work out. And he'd go to all these places looking for the coelacanth, and he'd go sort of fish hunting, and he'd throw dynamite into the water. I mean, it wasn't that he was this great fish lover. He was just trying to get these fish so he could study them. I mean, he was single-minded. And what happened towards the end of his life, it was actually very sad. He started to feel his faculties going. And one day, Margaret, his wife, got back to the house just to find a note on the table saying, "Attention, careful, do not go up to the study, cyanide." And eventually they went up and found he'd committed suicide. And he hadn't sort of said, "Oh, I'm really, you know, sorry, my love, thank you for all our life together," and everything like that. It was all, you know. He wrote this note saying, "I felt my mental faculties failing and I couldn't cope with that," so he just took his own life. But there's a whole, until very recently, the whole Institute of Ichthyology was started in Grahamstown, Rhodes University, named after him. And, you know, he was a byword. He was an extraordinary, famous, amazing person who was thought of with great respect, but also sort of fear. I mean, he didn't take any prisoners.
Yeah.
I think his students sort of, I don't know if he actually physically slapped them, but he verbally slapped them a lot.
What was it like, I mean, what were sort of the challenges for somebody like you, a writer who I believe hadn't written much on science before that? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, nothing.
To sort of immerse yourself to this depth in ichthyology and paleontology. I mean, what were the challenges for you in grappling with this material?
Well, I think, in a sense, it really helps not being a scientist, trying to tell a popular science story. Because I had to, you know, I started from the beginning. I knew nothing. Yeah. So I sort of had to learn very, very slowly, build up sort of layers of knowledge about it. Luckily, my husband is a zoologist, so he helped with some of the difficult terms. But I think once you learn something from the beginning and build up your knowledge, you know where to take the reader back to. So I had to, in essence, take the reader on the same journey that I'd been on to learn about evolution. And, you know, some of the scientific papers about the coelacanth slightly went over my head, but I found people who were able to explain them to me. And what the wonderful thing about this story is that it's just a good news story for everyone. You know, no one is hurt in the telling of the coelacanth story. So everyone was really happy to help, and you know, it was a fantastic experience. And we had so many adventures. Because I'd done the Bob Denard story before, I went back to the Comores and I was looked on with a certain amount of suspicion, and people sort of followed me around. And one day, Mark and I were taking photographs in the harbour where the fishermen, we were taking photographs of the night fishermen who went out to collect the coelacanths. And these two men walked up in dark glasses wearing suits, and they didn't quite have sort of little secret service things.
Yeah, pieces, yeah.
But they came up and they said, "I'm sorry, we have to take you to the chief of police now." And we said, "What?" We were just taking pictures of the coelacanth. Of the coelacanth fishermen, the night fishermen. And they said, "No, come with us." And we got marched off and interrogated for ages. And they had a thick file on me from my previous visits to the Comores. And we were taken back to our hotel, and they were going to deport us back to South Africa, but there wasn't a plane to South Africa, so they were going to send us to Dubai. And that was the first plane out. And we ended up having this meeting with the chief of police. And we were sitting in his office, which was this strange, you know, one little room with nothing in it apart from a filing cabinet. And as we were walking in, this sort of, sitting there with him talking about being deported, this sort of white rabbit sort of hopped through the room and out the other door. It was totally surreal. And eventually they let us sort of stay there.
Did it have a watch and was it late? And, no.
Not quite. They could have, but it was extraordinary
But
adventure
what were you
for us.
supposed to have done to be deported?
We were supposed to be, they thought that we were there as agents for the mercenaries and we were planning another coup.
Oh, I see.
So,
And the thick file was from the previous coups that you had engineered in
yes,
other countries.
exactly.
And, yes, okay.
Talking about coups tomorrow, just
Yeah.
anyway.
Okay. I was going to save this question for later, but since you brought up sort of the adventures that you had, Sam told me earlier today about a story that I promised I would save for when we were on stage. And so I'd like you to tell us a little bit about when you were in Indonesia and nearly got killed or nearly died.
I nearly died, but I didn't nearly get killed at all. What happened is that the Coelacanth story, hang on, we might just, if we go forward a bit, we can skip. These are, before we get to Indonesia, this is in the Comores, and this is one of the early coelacanths that were found by fishermen. That's in the market. That is the harbour in the Comores, Moroni Harbour. Oh no, this is later. Okay, I'll stay there. So what happened is that in 1998, just as I'd started working on the book, I'd already started researching it and been to the Comores, and we were actually in California at the time where my husband was working on a film, and we'd heard that another coelacanth had been found in a fish market in Indonesia, and this was the first coelacanth that had been found outside southern Africa. And they were keeping it, the person who'd found it was keeping it completely secret, but we happened to run into his supervisor from Berkeley University, and he said, listen, I'll tell you the secret and I'll put you in touch with this guy. And we got in touch with him and said, look, if you find another one, please let us know. And a couple of weeks later, we got we were in South Africa at the time, got an email saying we found another fish. So we jumped on the next plane to Indonesia, and we spent the next 3 months living on this tiny island off Sulawesi, waiting and hoping for another fish, another coelacanth to be caught, which it wasn't. But anyway, one night we were living near the scientist, waiting for the coelacanth to turn up. And we went to visit him one night, and we were walking through the dark. There was no electricity on this island or anything, no running water. And I suddenly felt this piercing pain in my foot. And we got to the scientist's house, and there were these 2 puncture holes in my foot. And they were sort of like snake puncture holes. And the only snakes that lived on the islands were venomous sea snakes. And we thought, oh my God. And we had this book called Where There Is No Doctor. And it said, what you have to do is you have to, first of all, you get a kitchen knife, because obviously where there's no doctor, there's no anesthetic or anything like that. You drink brandy, very important, put your foot up, get a kitchen knife, sterilize it in the flame of a candle, and then make an incision in your foot, 1/4 centimeter deep and 1/2 centimeter wide, which my husband took great pleasure in doing. Well, I was sort of happily quaffing the brandy, and then he was sort of sucking the poison out of it, while this scientist friend rushed to the village to try and get a boat to take us back to the main island, by which point he found out that in fact it wasn't a snake, it was a giant venomous centipede, and I'd be fine, and I lived. I'm here. But anyway, so it had nothing to do with the coelacanth, but it was just a,
but there was still venom in there. I mean, so it was a good. There was still venom in there. It was a good thing.
There was a venom, but I've still got the scar.
Okay.
But it was needless. He needn't have done all that cutting and sucking. But
Did you ever manage to? Did you ever go on dives where you actually saw them in their sort of their natural habitat? Have you done that?
No. I mean, the whole thing about the coelacanth, it lives very, very deep. Mainly, it lives below 100 meters, and I can dive to about 80 foot. I'm going.
Oh, I meant in a submersible. I mean,
in a submersible.
Yeah.
Hans Fricker.
Not you yourself.
No. But there's this wonderful German called Hans Fricker who built a submersible expressly. Well, he actually ended up building 2 submersibles expressly to go down and to be able to see a coelacanth, which he did, and he made these wonderful films of the coelacanth. But what more recently, in 2000, I think it was 2000. These South Africans were just doing this very technical kind of try-mix diving, which involves a combination of 3 different gases. And it means you can go very, very deep. And they were doing this deep dive to down below 100 meters. I think it was 104 meters. And they were just about to come up, because when you go very deep, you have to come up very, very, very slowly. So you only have 15 minutes bottom time for sort of 9 hours in the water. And as he was in his last minute, he was convinced he'd seen a coelacanth. And he got very excited, but they had to go up slowly. And he told his partners, I think I've seen a coelacanth. And they said, oh, rubbish, they're not found, they haven't been found off the coast of South Africa since 1938. But he said, no, and he organized these other trips. And on the second dive, when they went down, 2 of the divers, something went wrong with their equipment, and they were forced to do this rapid ascent, and one of the divers got decompression sickness and died. And actually 3 divers have died trying to see a coelacanth diving. Actually, if we just skip forward a little bit, I can show you, hang on, this is a good story, we're going to get to that in a bit. Okay, so this fish was, this was one of the deep sea divers in the Comores, actually, a Frenchman called Laurent Balester. And he took a picture of the coelacanth. You can see just how huge they are. And these are absolutely wonderful photographs that he took. This is its tail, this sort of what Marjorie Courtney Latimer described as its puppy dog tail. This is the limb-like fins, the sort of very arm-like fins that, as we might discuss in a bit, are the forerunners possibly to our arms. Okay. Should we show the, no, let's end with the video. Anyway, we'll do that later.
Okay. Sorry, you said you had a story about another one of the images?
Well, okay, going back. So what happened is that in 2002, South Africans from the JLB Smith Institute, hang on, we're going to go back. Wait a second. Let me just get back first, and then I'll start. Okay. So they decided they wanted to do a coelacanth project, and they wanted to get it. This is the time where the human genome was just being mapped, and they wanted to map a coelacanth genome to see exactly where the coelacanth fitted in the evolutionary tree to find its phylogeny. And so they went to the Comores. This Dr. Rosemary Dorrington went to the Comores, and she sort of said, look, can you catch me a coelacanth? And they said, look, it's not so easy. We haven't caught a coelacanth for 5 years. But she said, okay, but please try, and here's a kit if you do collect it. She met this lovely young Comoran scientist called Said Ahmada, and she said, if you do catch it, please take some blood and save it, and maybe we can use that to do a genome project. And so she went back to South Africa thinking maybe it's not going to happen, but hoping, crossing her fingers. And then just the next year, in a village called Hahaya, which is off the west coast of Grand Comore, a fisherman went out as usual, and he felt an unfamiliar tug. And as he lifted up his fishing line, he saw what in the Comores they call gombessa, a coelacanth, and he knew exactly what it is. The coelacanth is a creature of great pride, a source of great pride in the Comores. It's on their banknote and on their coins, and you can buy pareos with it on. And the hotel's called the Coelacanth, and the restaurants, everything's called the Coelacanth. A bit like the living goddess in the last talk. And so he pulled this fish to shore, and he knew that there'd be some reward, because fishermen get £100 still, which is the equivalent to maybe 3 or 4 years of income. It's a very, very poor country. So he tried to keep this coelacanth alive. He tethered it to his boat in the shallows, and as soon as the sun came up, his nephew caught a bush taxi into Moroni and went to the museum and told the museum director that he had a gombessa, and the museum director telephoned Said Ahmada and said, come quickly, and Said was very excited, and he went and got his collecting kit, and then he went by taxi to Hahaya and saw, indeed, it was a coelacanth, and it was still just alive. He could see its eyes shining, and it was still just very feebly flopping its limbs, and he was terrifically excited, so he took it out of the water, whereupon it died instantly, but he said it was definitely going to die anyway. And he took some blood out of it, and then he put it in the back of a red taxi and took it off to Moroni. And once he was there, he took some blood, and I can't really see, but I think that's him taking blood. Oh no, that's it. He took blood from he took tissue from major organs, the liver, the heart, the blood, lungs. And then Rosemary Dorrington had given him this sort of just a manual meat grinder, a meat mincer, because there's often no electricity in the Comores. So they put all the tissue through the mincer and then stored it in test tubes in the freezer in the museum. I think we've got a picture of them with the fish outside the museum. And they stored it there, and it just so happened that there was going to be a big coelacanth conference in South Africa several months later. And Said was going anyway, so he took the samples back to South Africa, showed them to Rosemary, who sort of ran them quickly, did assays in her lab. Here are all the bits that, the tubes that he took back, and discovered that they did have enough workable genetic material to analyze, and that they could attempt to sequence the coelacanth genome. But at that stage, she realized that she just had a small little machine, and I think she worked out it was going to take 494 years to sequence the coelacanth using her machine. So she contacted another scientist in America called Chris Amamiya, who works at University of Washington and is a long-time coelacanth fan and had written a lot on its science. And he got in touch with the Broad Institute in Massachusetts, who have a whole floor full of sequencing machines. And they got together a team, this was in 2003, and they got together a team of, I think it was 91 scientists from 40 institutes in 12 countries on all 6 inhabited continents. And they started slowly sequencing the coelacanth genome. But this is a genome with 3 billion base pairs, which is about the same as our genome. And each machine that they had could only sequence 100 base pairs at a time, so they had to sort of pick bits off different genes. And it took them a long time, and finally, in April last year, 2003, they managed to sequence the entire coelacanth genome, and they published it. It was the cover picture in Nature, and it was a massive story, because what they found out, that the coelacanth, which they never really knew which was the missing link. Was it the coelacanth or was it the lungfish? I mean, clearly it was neither, because the missing link had evolved into other things, but which was the closest relative to the missing link? And through this, they managed to find out that actually it was the lungfish, not the coelacanth, but that the coelacanth is incredibly closely related to us. And with current technology, the lungfish's genome is 40 times the size of ours, so they're never going to do that. So it's the coelacanth that holds all these really important clues to how we evolved, how we crawled out of the sea, how we grew limbs, how we learned to breathe and walk and excrete and do all those kind of things. So it was really, really, really amazing story.
But it has been established now that the lungfish is the tetrapod that was closest to the missing link, or is it just?
Yes, so the lungfish is closest. Okay. But the coelacanth, put it this way, the coelacanth is more closely related to us than it is to a salmon. The coelacanth is a cousin, just many times removed. So, I mean, it's a fantastic story. And it's, so it keeps going on. They're still doing all these what they're doing at the moment, they found out the coelacanth has autopods, which I think are the top bit, and zoogopods, which are the bottom bit of, equivalent to our arms. But they found out that it has little buds to the stylopods, I think they're called, which are fingers. And although coelacanths don't have fingers, they found out it has the genes that can encode the proteins to tell things to become fingers, buds to become fingers. And because they don't have a living coelacanth to work on, they inserted these genes into a mouse embryo, and they found out that the mouse could grow little fingers and toes using the coelacanth genes instead of its own genes. So obviously this precursor to fingers and toes, the sort of evolutionary step, was there in the coelacanth.
That's
so
fascinating.
It's like this sort of time machine. It's wonderful.
Wow. I was curious to, because when I read about the coelacanth that was caught and then sent, its tissue samples were sent over for the sequencing, I was curious to know what the coelacanth status is, vis-a-vis. I mean, it's a protected species
Oh gosh,
now?
yes. I mean, it must be one of the rarest You know, you can't catch it on purpose. You can't officially sell it.
But you can't. I mean, like this fisherman, are you compelled to throw it back as soon as you catch one?
They're meant to. They're not compelled to, I don't think. But they went to, a lot of conservationists have done a lot of work with the fishermen of the Comores who, you know, have this minuscule income, and they used to get a lot of money for every fish. You know, at one point the Japanese went there, and the Japanese very much like rare fish, and were sort of offering lots of money for it.
And the Chinese were buying it up to manufacture sort of elixir of immortality or something like that.
Exactly, which of course works.
Of course,
You might try it, no. But the fishermen had been persuaded to put the fish back because they realized that it was something really important for their heritage and they should preserve the coelacanth. And while the coelacanth is still living off Comoran waters, the Comores still feels it has some sort of prestige and dignity and something that the rest of the world wants to see. I mean, unfortunately, it's very difficult to get to the Comores, and when you get there, there's sort of one tiny hotel that's open, but it's so beautiful, and you know, if you can make the effort, it's an amazing place to go to.
And is there a census of sorts as to how many? I mean, is there a count of the coelacanths that are?
Well, they try to do that. I mean, each of the divers who've been down, either in the submersibles or the French diver who went down, they log every single fish, and because the markings are different on each fish, the little white flecks are different on every fish, they name everyone and they count. But I mean, they live very, very deep in these caves. They don't know how many are there, but they think that maybe they're, you know, a few hundred in the Comores, and then they've been catching them a bit off the coast of Tanzania and Mozambique, and they've found, I think, 4 in Indonesia. There are not many of these fish around, and I think what's amazing is this fish has been around virtually unchanged for 400 million years, and I just hope that, you know, we don't go catching too many. And what they've done with the genome, they've put it online, open access, so they only had to get one fish to do it, and now anyone can work with the sequenced fish. You don't have to get another one, so hopefully they'll be left in peace for the next 70 million years.
I mean, some of the best science books and popular science books are almost structured in the way of a mystery novel. I mean, there's a mystery at the beginning which the author sort of sits down and helps unravel, or sort of unravels over the course of the book. And unlike in mystery novels, I mean, there are still obviously mysteries left at the end of the science book. And I was wondering, for scientists and investigators today, what are sort of the 2 or 3 chief mysteries that they are still puzzled about with the coelacanth?
Well, I think one of them is exactly how the limbs are formed, how they work. Another is how the lungs evolved to be able to breathe air, how they learned to excrete. I mean, there are all sorts of those things that to scientists are of utmost importance, because only in understanding where we came from can we have an idea of where we're going and what's going to happen next. So it is immensely important. It seems kind of arcane to be putting so much energy and money and time into a fish, a dead fish, but actually it holds so many answers to what has been and what will be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we'll do now is just quickly look at the video and then move to take questions from the audience. Does the video play from there?
I think, oh look, there's a fin. Ah, we've got a couple more.
Okay.
There's pretty fish. I think, this is the, that's the nature cover. Is this the video?
I think so, yes.
I mean, it's just rather wonderful that this fish, who lives so deeply, it moves very, very slowly. And this is one of the problems, that when it's caught, because it has such a very slow metabolism, that fighting with the hook, when the fisherman brings it up to the surface, builds up lactic acid, and actually that's why they think the coelacanth dies, not from any sort of injury, and why they've never been able to keep them alive at the surface.
There haven't been any populations established in the Atlantic? No?
Not yet.
Not yet.
But they found, I mean, all sorts of strange silver little jewelry or talisman, coelacanth talisman, found that was sort of made in Mexico or somewhere a couple of 100 years ago, and no one knows how they knew exactly what a coelacanth looked like. So maybe they They did exist. By the way, we've just totally pirated this video off the internet, so if anyone comes from France, please don't tell them.
We can actually maybe even let the video play while we take questions. I mean, for Sam, there's mics floating around here.
Oh, good, hooray, South African.
And when I was growing up, there was this great excitement of the coelacanth. And somehow the word larynx marks comes to my mind. Was there anything found there? Or was it just that I remembered wrong?
No. What happened was that when Smith was flying to the Comores to get the second fish, they spent the night in Lorenzo Marques. But they have actually found, coelacanths off the Mozambique coast now. But actually, they didn't find any there at the time, but he did overnight in Lorenzo Marques. And there's this wonderful description. He wrote a brilliant book called Old Forelegs. Wonderful description of the heat in Lorenzo Marques and tossing and turning, and would the fish be alive, and would the French have taken it, and would his life's work be for nothing? Because, anyway, he was a very dramatic writer. It's a wonderful book.
Another question, the platypus, is that any connection in East development?
With its, I don't think they're not from the same tree, but when they were doing the analysis of the coelacanth genome, I think that they put it, what they did is they analyzed the coelacanth and they compared it to the other known genomes from sort of sharks and sort of other slimy things up to, I think they did the platypus, and because they must have some genome.
Of course.
And humans,
Yeah.
but elephants and monkeys and dogs and everything like that. And they put it all on this sort of wonderful chart of where it fits in. So the platypus is further up there than the coelacanth, but it's less alive.
Over here?
I'm just wondering if the coelacanth, I was very interested when you said it's more closely related to us than to the salmon. Is it in fact more closely related to us than to any other fish? Or does it have some fishy relatives or anything else going on in the sea, or a reptile or an amphibian? I mean, where does it fit in?
Okay, if you're going to have everything coming down, the first fishy thing is a lungfish, then it's the coelacanth. So it's more closely related to a lungfish than it is to us, but it's less closely related to any other fish than it is to a lungfish and to us. Well, it's more closely related to a reptile than it is to us. So it's so the chart you get this sort of wonderful diagram.
It was on its way to becoming some sort of a reptile, or
well, it was, but it didn't evolve. But it had the first prerequisites to evolving. And the lungfish, which doesn't have the same arms and legs, but does have an ability to breathe out of water, which is why it is more closely related.
Further questions? Are there? Oh, there's one at the back over there. There's two at the back over there. It's really hard to see.
This is what celebrities must feel like the whole time.
Absolutely.
I'd like to know, since we have so many aquaria around the world, whether they have been able to capture a coelacanth and put it in an aquarium for people to see live.
No, I mean, a coelacanth has never survived for more than, I think it's 9 hours at the surface, because I think it lives in the cold and in the deep, and the trauma of being caught has always killed it. But most natural history museums in the world have a stuffed coelacanth. So you can see a stuffed one, or you can see this footage.
Yeah,
but I hope now they're going to stop trying to catch a live one.
In the book, in fact, at the end, there's an index of the museums around the world where you can actually go and see a stuffed or frozen coelacanth.
Yeah, but only in the American.
Only I see, okay.
That's American.
I see.
Good afternoon. I want to ask, you mentioned that the reason scientists thought the coelacanth was actually extinct was because the fossil record actually disappears after a certain point. Has anyone been able to explain why exactly that is?
I think, do you know, they probably have, and I'm just going to hazard a guess. I think it's because the coelacanth, where the coelacanth lived, was in a certain kind of rocky bottoms of the things, and then various sort of material got put on top of it, and where they lived didn't have that rock anymore. Do you know what? I'm not going to answer that question because I'm just going to get myself in trouble. You probably know the answer to that question better than me. Sorry.
To write a book on a topic as rare as this, does it take a certain amount of obsession? Like, was it almost as much as Smith, or did you obsess at least a little about the fish?
Well, luckily, my first child wasn't born until I'd finished the book. So I was able to obsess about it without neglecting my children. No, it did. I mean, I think writing any book, it enters your sleeping and waking hours. You can't think about anything else. And we had this wonderful opportunity to just go off for 6 months and spend 3 months in Africa and then 3 months in Indonesia, just trying to immerse ourselves in everything coelacanth. Yeah, I became obsessed by the people, about the fish, about the idea of evolution. And it's great to do that full immersion into something. Yes, I did, but hopefully I was nicer to members of my family.
How long did it take from start to finish?
Actually, it was quite quick because I did it completely. It took about a year and a bit.
Full immersion.
Full immersion for a year and a bit. But it was a wonderful year and a bit. That was fantastic.
Yeah. Yes, there's another microphone.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ma'am, I wanted to ask that you told the coelacanth you saw was somewhat 5 foot long. So what's the average size of a coelacanth?
The average size is somewhere between, the largest they've seen is just over 2 meters, and then they've seen little baby ones, because coelacanths give birth to live young, so they have up to 23, I think the most they found is 23 little coelacanth pups, fully formed, beautiful little coelacanths. So they grow from this size when they're born up to 2 and a bit meters. And they're big. I mean, that photograph makes them seem really big because of the perspective, but they're human-sized, big human-sized.
Over here?
What do they eat? They eat little fish. Yeah.
How old do they grow to?
I don't know that they even know. That's one of the questions, because they've never been able to actually study them in captivity. They don't know when they die. I think the oldest one that they found was 50-something years old, but they don't know. And possibly they'll never know. But you can tell, I think you can tell by the number of sort of lines on their scales. I became obsessed by the coelacanth scale, and I went through a stage of being very scared of flying. But I had this one coelacanth scale that I was given, and I used to have to take it with me on every aeroplane I went on to sort of protect me from the airplane crashing. So yes, I was probably pretty obsessed by coelacanth.
Does it feel like any other fish scale, or does it feel?
It's very hard. I mean, no, it doesn't.
Okay.
It's very thick and very hard and big, and it's
And they allow that through security now?
They do. There's no metal. Well, I don't know. This was before the days of security.
Yes, I think there's a question there.
It was a very rewarding talk, I must say.
Thank you.
Do you think, I mean, I don't know, in the olden times, were there lots and lots of these fish, the species?
Yes, I think that, well...
And then my second question.
Oh, yeah.
I haven't read your book, I'm going to read it. We have the mythology in the Hindu, this thing, the Dash avatars, the first avatar of Lord Vishnu was a Matsya, was a fish. Now, this names you've developed and things,
Yeah, maybe that all ties up. Your first question is, yes, they used to be everywhere. They've found fossils in North America, South America, England, all across Europe, Russia. So coelacanths used to be really, really widespread, and they had lots of different species. And as to, I don't know enough, but it could well be. Maybe the coelacanth, like the living goddess, maybe the spirit of God lives in the coelacanth.
Yeah, I mean, this one particular concept that you talk about in your book, ontogeny, I think.
Yes.
Which is fascinating. I mean, it's been disproven now, but the concept was that when an embryo develops, it goes through basically every single evolutionary predecessor to the animal that it's going to grow into. and so therefore maybe a sort of a human baby embryo would go through a fish-like creature followed by a reptilian creature followed maybe by a
Well, they do
an
say
ape-like.
they do say that
yeah.
if you have a baby, you can throw it into a swimming pool and it'll be able to breathe underwater for the first few days. I never tested it, but you know, maybe. But maybe
Do they really
you know.
say that?
Yeah, no,
Oh.
it's true, isn't it? Yeah.
Don't try that at home. I mean,
So maybe that's that's
Yeah.
our fishy ontology.
Maybe, yeah.
Maybe there is an element of the same.
You mentioned that they used to be so widespread. Is there a possibility that they were much closer to the surface and so potentially might have come out and walked on the land, and they've survived by gradually going deeper and deeper and deeper, and now exist at this very, very deep level where they could never survive at the surface anymore?
Well, I guess, I mean, probably not, but it's a lovely thought. I mean, possibly they were a bit more shallow. I mean, different species would have had different kind of inner workings, but I don't think they would have changed that much. What they found is through filming the coelacanths, they found they don't actually ever put any weight on their fins, on these lobe-like fins. What they do is they stand on their heads. They do headstands to detect prey. If they can sense predators anywhere, somewhere close, they have something called a rostral organ in their nose, in their snout, and they do headstands. But I mean, it's a lovely thought that they used to be sort of a bit more shallow. I'm sort of personally very pleased that they do live deep. Otherwise, we would have caught them all, and probably the Japanese would have eaten them all.
we must also remember that, I mean, when the coelacanth, I mean, you know, a few 100 million years ago, the temperatures of the ocean were very different to what they are now. And so therefore, it may have been colder up top, and so therefore they may then have gone down to cooler waters now.
Very pleased you're here. Also a fish expert, wrote a brilliant book about fish. Probably knows more than me.
And I think we're just out of time. So thank you, Sam, for your presentation and your wonderful talk. It's great.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all for your questions.